Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a review of this device here. This is called the PowKiddy X39. Now, PowKiddy has a specific line of devices under the X umbrella, and honestly, I'm usually not a big fan of these. But this one was kind of interesting. You know, just at face value, it actually looks like a pretty good handheld. On top of that, it has a 4-inch screen, HDMI out, as well as USB ports for external controllers. And I thought at $40, this was a device that I couldn't pass up. And so let's do one of my trademark deep dive reviews. I'm always excited to see if we're going to find that next hidden gem for under $50. And who knows, this one might actually fit the bill, but it could also be pretty terrible. I think we're going to have a lot of fun here, so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, to start, let's jump into the specs. So this is running an ATM 7051 CPU, and from what I could tell, this is typically used in tablets made for children. It features 128 megabytes of LPDDR2 RAM, and it also has 128 megabytes of internal storage, which is where the firmware resides. It features a 4.3-inch display with a 480 by 272 resolution. And the battery is 2500 milliamp hours. It says it's going to get about 5 hours of battery life. For me, it's been about 4. And like I mentioned in the intro, it does have mini HDMI connectivity. It also has a headphone jack, dual USB ports, and I'm not really sure what the operating system is here. I think it's one of those generic Linux-based operating systems. We'll get a feel for it later in the video. But for now, let's do a quick unboxing. Now, to be perfectly honest, I have not tested a lot of X series devices from PowKiddy. Generally, the design of these just really puts me off. But I've tested a few of them here on this channel, and I have to say, out of all of them, this one looks the most sleek. It comes with a generic SD card, and as you can see here, 32 gigabytes altogether. But yeah, overall, I actually really like the look of this device. It feels a little bit lightweight in the hands. It's only 188 grams, which is pretty light for a handheld this size. But I also like the silver accents around the sides of the device, and thankfully there's no big PowKiddy logo either. The shoulder and trigger buttons are in line. They feel pretty good. They're a little bit clicky. And you can see up top we have a power button, USB-C charging port, a mini HDMI connection, headphone jack, and then our volume buttons. On the bottom we have two different USB-A connectors. These are made for external controllers. And then of course our micro SD card and a reset button. And there's nothing else along those sides. So now let's take a look at the front of the device. First thing here, we have a Nintendo Switch style analog stick, but this does not click down for L3. But it feels pretty good. It reminds me of the analog sticks that were on something like the original Retroid Pocket 1. Either way, nice and sturdy. Now the D-pad uses a rubber membrane connection, but it feels a little bit looser than the D-pads I'm used to. If anything, I would say it's kind of reminiscent of a D-pad that's been broken in for a few years. So I would say this D-pad is not very tight or precise, but it'll be just fine, I think, for casual retro gaming. Now on the other side, the face buttons actually feel very good. I think these also have kind of a loose membrane to them, but what that actually means in real life here is that they're very easy to press down on. They do get pretty flush with the case itself, something I don't really like, but because these buttons are so rounded, it doesn't ever feel like they're going to fall into the case. The menu, start, and select buttons have a nice soft clickiness to them. They feel pretty pleasant. And then we have that single mono speaker right here. Now overall, I think the ergonomics and just the feel of the device altogether are pretty dang good, especially for something that costs about $40. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to review it, is because it looks good and it looked like it would feel pretty good in the hands too, and it does. If I were to compare this to a similar device, I think I would use the Pocket Go version 2 or the Play Go as you see here. The shape is very similar, although this one uses a 3.5-inch screen. And the D-pad position is swapped here, and the PlayGo has this little slider analog thing that's just terrible. But I would say overall the PlayGo is a more narrow version of the X39 here. And I'm a pretty big fan of the PlayGo, and so it's pretty cool to be able to see a similar device that's a little bit wider and being released in 2022. Okay, now let's have a look at the screen. Now the first thing I noticed is this is not OCA laminated. And I don't think that's a huge deal on a budget device like this, but the screen itself is separated from the glass by quite a bit, at least a millimeter here. And I think in the end, what that really means is that the picture quality is going to be a little bit hazy just by virtue of the distance between the display and the glass itself. So let's turn it on and get a feel for the firmware next. Like I mentioned before, I'm not really sure what this is based on. This could be like a really stripped down version of Android, but if I was to guess, this is definitely something that's originally based on Linux. And I've seen this interface before, mostly on other cheap handhelds. And it's just kind of a generic way of browsing. You can go through the whole game list here, or you can tab over to the type section and browse by device. There's 10 total consoles here that are emulated. And they also have things like history and favorites and search. Altogether, this is a functional operating system. It's definitely not something that's very nice to look at. It looks like it's straight out of 2007. But this is kind of the appeal to it as well, because as you'll see later in this video, I think this device might be a pretty good gift for somebody who knows nothing about emulation. And so in that regard, the ability to just go into the type section and then figure out which console you want to jump into and then pick your game, all those things are completely functional. However, as you launch a game, you may start to see some cracks in the overall experience. Number one right here, as you can see, it's scaling it to full screen. I'm not quite sure what the exact aspect ratio is here, but if I had to eyeball it, it's somewhere between 3:2 and 16:9. And of course, stretching a 4:3 game like a Nintendo game here, it just kind of looks terrible, at least in my eyes. And that distance between the glass and the display here does make it quite hazy overall. Now, if we go into the menu section, we can jump into the settings, and there are a couple different things we can mess with here, including things like keyboard mapping. But there's also a scaling option. We can either do full screen or scale. So let's try out the scale instead of full screen and see how that looks. And oh my gosh, this is terrible. I was hoping it would be 4:3, but it looks like it's 8:7 instead. And to me, that's just not something I'd want to play on a widescreen like this. And so if I had to choose between the two, something that's 8:7, which is basically a square, or something that's like a full widescreen like this, believe it or not, I would actually prefer the widescreen. Okay, so yeah, right now I am not very impressed with at least the image quality of the emulation right here. But let's be honest here, I'm super picky about this stuff, and this is a $40 device. So let's see what other redeeming qualities we can find within. Well, the next thing I saw is that if you go into the menu, you can select Save Game, and it'll actually save a save state. And then if you go and launch that game again, you can go in and load it right back up. And so again, for somebody who's not familiar with emulation, that's going to be a really handy feature to be able to just jump in and out of your games using a save state like that. And in some cases, the scaling actually looks decent. For example, here's Game Boy running at a 10:9 aspect ratio, and no complaints here. Same thing with Game Boy Advance. This runs at a 3:2 aspect ratio, and as you can see here, it almost fills up the whole screen. And so in particular, if you want to play Game Boy Advance games on a dedicated device like this doesn't look half bad. But now remember, the resolution on this is pretty low. It's 270 vertical pixels, which means this is not like crystal clear and sharp, and it's not a perfect integer scale either. So you're going to have some pixel distortion. But again, I think if somebody's not familiar with emulation, they're just going to be excited to have a whole Game Boy Advance catalog on a device like this. So now let's try testing out some of those features that we had available. First, we'll start with plugging in an external controller. I'm going to use some cheap generic ones here because I think that might probably work the best. But as you can see, when I plug it in, it doesn't work. Even if I exit out of a game and then launch the game, nothing works in the menus. And even when restarting the device with the controller plugged in, nothing seems to work. I'm not able to map the buttons in order to get them to register at all. And I got desperate here. I tried like the most generic of the generic controllers because typically these have the best compatibility, but still all the same, I couldn't get anything to work. So there may be some magic mojo required to get this up and running, but the way I see it, if I'm not able to get it going in 20 minutes, then I don't think a typical user would either. So in that sense, unfortunately, I don't think that external controller support is going to be a viable option. Okay, so that feature sucks. Let's move on to HDMI, see if this one works. And so what I'm using here is a mini HDMI to regular HDMI connector, and then I'm just going to hook it up to my screen capture device. And it kind of worked, so I did get a picture, but it had this weird pink or magenta tint to it, and I couldn't get any audio to work either. And again, I tried this in various different ways, but nothing seemed to work. Now, as you can see, some PlayStation 1 games work, but I think it's going to be limited to just like those 2D games like this. Now, I only actually tested a few of these because none of them were in English, but all the same, it actually seemed pretty surprisingly decent for a $40 handheld. Now, one thing I did want to try out was arcades. I think because the fact that the analog stick is up top, that means that it's kind of an analog predominant setup. And so I started with Super Street Fighter 2, which is a CPS2 game here on the arcade. And the first thing I noticed is that the shoulder buttons do not register correctly. But when I went into the mapping section, I found that there actually is no way to map the shoulder buttons within the menu. And so for 6-button games like Super Street Fighter 2 here, you're actually limited to only mapping 4 of those 6 buttons. So you're going to have to choose which moves you cannot do when playing this game. Now that being said, the analog stick was nice and responsive. It actually was pretty fun to play with. I just wish I could use all the buttons. And on the bright side, Neo Geo works really well because that's only a 4-button system. You can put all 4 on the face buttons here and everything works nice. So not quite a perfect arcade experience, but a lot of games are going to play well, and Neo Geo is going to be great too. And so next for me, I wanted to try out Super Nintendo, one of my favorite systems of all time. And what I found is that while the game list is pretty comprehensive, there are hundreds of games listed, some of the big heavy hitters are not there at all. For example, none of the Super Mario World games. So instead I tried Super Adventure Island, which is close enough. And I was surprised to find that the gaming experience on this was pretty terrible. There was a lot of audio crackling, and then a mixture of speed ups and slowdowns too. So there must be some sort of frame skip going on here. Either way, Super Nintendo was not great. And it's also displaying an 8:7 aspect ratio, which is not my preferred aspect ratio for Super Nintendo. To me, it's just a little bit too skinny. Thankfully, Sega Genesis does play at a proper 4:3, as you can see here, and it runs really well too. So between these two 16-bit systems, Sega Genesis is a much better experience. Now, the lack of those specific Super Nintendo games got me thinking, what can we do about this SD card? Let's plug it into our computer and see what we can get out of it. And first thing you see here is it just has a regular old folder structure. You can go into the emulation config folder and you can find all of your save games here. They're labeled as .prg files. But on top of that, you can go into the game section and here's your ROM list right here. And within each of these, for example, the FC one for Nintendo, each game has its own subfolder, and then within that is the .nes file. And then back in the games folder, there is a BIOS folder. This has the PS1, Neo Geo, and PGM BIOS. Additionally, there is a music folder, so you could put on MP3s and listen to them on the device. Same thing with a photo viewer. And there's actually even a video player here, and it runs MP4 files. Let's test it out here, and man, I hope this isn't porn. Okay, we're good. This is just some sort of commercial or something. Either way, you can add your own MP4 files if you wanted to this device to kind of make it like an impromptu movie player. Just bear in mind it has a very low resolution screen. Now, let's go back into that game folder and let's see if we can start adding our own games. I'm really interested to see whether or not this is going to work. So let's go into the FC folder here. And then I'm just going to drag over some NES games and see if they actually get picked up. I'm going to try to put them in various formats to see what works. For Castlevania, I'm just going to leave it like that. For Contra, I'm going to add a number to it, the one after Dr. Mario. And then for River City Ransom, I'm going to add a number to that, but I'm going to also make a folder. So I'm going to put the game in that folder that's labeled with a number. And we'll see whether or not any of this matters when we get into the system. So back on the device, if we go back to the NES section, none of these games show up. And I was kind of expecting that. We probably have to refresh the game list. So we'll press the X button here and then select Sync Media Playlist. This will take a few minutes, but it'll basically run through and find any new files. Now when we go back to the NES section, it found all 3 of those files here. In fact, it looks like you don't need to label them at all. All you have to do is just throw in the ROM and it's going to pick up on them. And yeah, it booted them up just fine. So what I would recommend doing here is moving this file structure over to a FAT32 formatted SD card, and then just get rid of all those games that are already on there, and then you can load them up with your own. Instead of having a bunch of non-English games and everything else, you could really curate this the way you want it. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest strengths of this device, is that if you are savvy about how to set these things up, you could grab one of these devices, move over that file structure, put all of the very specific ROMs on there, and then you could give it to anybody and they would be able to figure out how to run your games and even how to load save states. And so this would work out pretty well for, say, a child, or maybe you have a sibling who's not very tech savvy. This would be a pretty cheap and good option and not something you'd have to worry about them breaking on accident. And so while this device is not going to win any awards anytime soon, I do think it has a specific use case to it. And so this is actually my setup right here. I went through and I deleted out all those games. I put the file structure in a new SD card, and then I loaded up my own personal favorites. So I have my CPS games, my Final Burn Alpha games, as well as NES, Super Nintendo, things like that. And I gotta say, once I loaded my own ROM library on here, I like this thing about 10 times more than I did before. There's nothing worse than getting a device where you can't manage your own game systems. But it's still kind of cool when it all comes together like this, even if it's in a cheapo product. But before we get to the summary, let me show you one more thing. Super Nintendo, I think, is basically unplayable on this device. Even playing Super Mario World, a game that should not run poorly on any system, it actually chugs. Like, it chugs more than any other system I've ever tested before. And so if Mario World isn't going to play properly, then no Super Nintendo game is going to be worth playing. Okay, I think we've seen enough here. Let's go ahead and get into the summary part. Let's talk about what I like first. Number one, I think this device has a pretty good size to it. It's about the size of a cell phone, maybe a little bit thicker, but it's actually just kind of an impressive looking device, and it feels relatively comfortable in the hands too. The D-pad and face buttons are decent. They're not going to win any awards this year, but altogether, I wouldn't actually complain about them. They're just kind of good. And finally, this thing costs between $40 and $45. To me, that's a pretty good price. Nowadays, that's the price of going to a movie, getting a popcorn and a soda. And so while I don't really have high expectations for a retro handheld at that price point, it still leaves me feeling better than I did after watching Morbius. Now let's talk about the things I don't like about the PowKiddy X39. Number one is the software interface. I mean, this is straight out of 2007. And next, I'm not a huge fan of the scaling options. I wish we had more ability to change the aspect ratio. Some of them were fine. Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, even the arcade systems weren't bad. But Nintendo in particular really kind of drove me crazy. It's also a shame that the arcade buttons don't work properly for 6-button games. It'll be fine if you want to play something that only uses 1 or 2 buttons, but fighting games, in particular the Capcom ones, aren't going to be the full experience. And I wasn't expecting great things, but the screen quality on this is pretty poor. The resolution is lower than I thought it would be, and the kind of big gap between the glass and the display does make it kind of hazy altogether. I was also hoping that the HDMI out and those controller options were actually going to work. After all, they put them in the device. And so it's kind of a letdown that they don't actually work, at least in my testing. And finally, Super Nintendo performance on this was disappointingly bad. I figured that since PS1 was halfway decent and arcade was pretty good too, that we'd at least be able to play half the Super Nintendo games. But at the end of the day, the frame skip they have enabled in here just kind of takes away from that whole experience. And so at this price point, I think it's a pretty decent device, but I think if you just added maybe another $20, maybe $30 to it, you would have a much better time by playing something like the original Anbernic RG350, or the Pocket Go version 2, or the PlayGo. These two devices are also quite low powered, but they have a nice 4:3 aspect ratio, and they can both run the OpenDingX beta as well as the Atom firmware image, which is just going to give you a more seamless and integrated browsing experience. On top of that, you can look at box art, jump in and out of your games, and scale them any way you'd like. Now, these two are in totally different price ranges, and I think they have different uses too. The PlayGo and the RG350 are the kind of device you'd buy for yourself. Meanwhile, the PowKiddy X39 would be something you'd want to buy for somebody who just doesn't know anything about emulation and just wants to play retro games and doesn't know enough about scaling or any other stuff to really care about it. And so in that regard, if somebody's looking for a device that just feels kind of decent in the hands and can play some of those classic games, in the end, I wouldn't say this is a bad device. But it is $40 and you are going to get what you pay for. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this of any interest to you at all, or is this another pass? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.